So we're currently coming towards the end of the first international window of 2025, and I thought this would be a good opportunity for me to have a look at the hosts ahead of the World Cup in 2026 next year. Obviously, they are the joint hosts of the US, Mexico and Canada, and I have already heard fans in England and some European friends already talk about who's the strongest team, who's the host nation, who we would like to avoid and ideally draw, and all those sorts of things. I thought I would give you guys an insight into how I believe English and European fans currently see these three nations at the moment. Are there any of these teams to fear, and which one will be the best at their home World Cup? So grab a cup of tea and let's take a look. Let's start with Canada, currently ranked 31st in the FIFA World Rankings, which I do feel is a little bit harsh considering where Mexico and the US are. But we'll take the FIFA rankings with a pinch of salt because everybody knows they're just a load of nonsense. The Canadian national team, though, over recent years has really drawn some interest in it, particularly in England, but also across Europe, but mainly because of their performances leading up to the last World Cup, where, of course, they qualified for Qatar. It was the first time they've reached the World Cup in 36 years, and I think what made them really well known in this country in particular is because they were managed by Englishman John Herdman, and he's ultimately transformed them since he took charge in 2018. They went on a 17-game unbeaten run under him, and in February 2022 were named the most improved international side in the world, and they've never looked back since. They've maintained that form. They are, of course, currently managed by Jesse Marsh, another manager who is familiar to the English fan base. Former manager of Leeds, of course, but he is an American, which is really interesting. But since taking over, they're staying in the fight, aren't they? Alongside Mexico and Canada. In fact, on this recent international break, they have just beaten the US in the third place playoff of the Nations League for CONCACAF. A very good result, playing the US in the United States as well. So beating the US in their own backyard in an international competitive fixture is a sign of where Canada are at the minute. Back in June last year, though, they did come to Europe to play some international friendlies. They did lose 4-0 against the Netherlands and were roundly beaten, it has to be said. However, 3 days later, they got a very respectable 0-0 draw against France, which is obviously no mean feat in France as well. So this Canadian team are no pushovers, and people in Europe have taken notice of that. They also arguably have the best player out of Canada, US and Mexico, that of course being Alphonso Davies. He's probably the most famous player out of these three nations as well. Current fullback playing for Bayern Munich, is truly a world-class player, there's no doubt about it. There are of course other players from Canada playing in Europe, but not really any names that many English or European fans will be too familiar with outside of their club bases at least. But really what I see Canada as is a very well-oiled, organised team machine. I believe they're a team that could get results against anybody, and they've proven that. They very much play for each other. They play as a unit, and I think they now understand international football. They've got a system that they like to stick to, and ultimately they're an organised team that no matter who draws them in the World Cup are going to be very difficult to break down, and who knows how strong Canada are going to be with that home advantage. I do think though, out of the three host nations, the US, Mexico and Canada, I think Canada can play this tournament with the least amount of fear and pressure. I'm not saying they won't have pressure, but I think the American public and the Mexican public in particular and their press are going to be much more fierce with those international teams and expect a lot more and put more pressure on. And I think Canada really can be a little bit more relaxed about their approach to this World Cup. Obviously they're going to want to do well, but I don't think they're going to have the same level of pressure and scrutiny as these other two home nations will. That may work in their favour at this World Cup. Overall, I think Canada are going to cause some real upsets. Not a team I would like England to draw. If I'm being honest, I want to avoid all the home nations. I think it's going to be experience though that costs them at this level, but ultimately I think they're a team that could cause some upsets at this World Cup. Mexico, right, Mexico straight off the bat, from conversations I've had, this is the nation where most of us want our games to be played. England fans, trust me, want to see England play in Mexico. Forget Canada in the US. We feel like this is a proper footballing country, and I think as hosts they will be a level above. They will absolutely be a level above Canada and the US. No disrespect to them, but I think the Mexican fan base, they're much more of a traditional footballing powerhouse, and I believe their fan base will just be unreal, and I think the stadiums will be more iconic, more classic, and I just think most of us dream about watching our team in Mexico rather than in the US or Canada. But Mexico, from my perspective, feel like a team that have always promised to do more than what they've actually delivered, at least on the international stage. Now, out of these three nations, they're the country with the most history at this this level. But it seems like, I mean, I've lost track how many years as a child people were saying, oh, Mexico might be a little bit of a dark horse, or they might cause some upsets, and they've never really gone on and done anything significant in a World Cup. And I think sometimes that pressure has got to them, or that quality or perceived lack of quality sometimes has been their downfall. It's amazing a country with such a huge population and interest in football doesn't sometimes quite produce the talent that you'd expect it to produce, if I'm honest with you. I just feel though like the US and Canada, watching a game there, it'd be very corporate, very capitalist. I think you'll get all those halftime shows and pop stars and big screens and fan zones. I feel like Mexico will be a lot more raw and a lot more genuine of a fan experience. I really do believe that. Mexico are currently ranked 19th in the FIFA World Rankings, which is relatively high, actually. You know, they're not doing bad. They are, as of this international break, also the latest CONCACAF champions, having beaten Canada and Panama in the final to be named the Nations League champions of CONCACAF. So, great result for them, and clearly they're a team that now have a track record of winning things. Their current manager is Javier Aguirre, his third spell in charge actually of Mexico, which is very unusual from a European perspective. I can't think of any international teams in Europe that have had a manager 3 times, but he's clearly finding results and it's working for them. Raul Jimenez will probably be the most familiar player to English fans. Obviously he spent a lot of time in England. So they also have a small number of other players currently playing in Europe. Jimenez at Milan, Pineda at Greece. The vast majority of the Mexican team though do play in the Mexican league, so they are a little bit, probably actually, the most unknown team from a European and English person's perspective. So it's difficult as an outsider and someone who doesn't watch CONCACAF football to truly know what this Mexican side is capable of, really. Mexico has historically, though, been the powerhouse of this corner of the world, and that has now changed, it has to be said. The US and Canada are now much more competitive and closely aligned, if not superior in some ways, to the Mexican national team. But essentially, it is just much more of a level playing field now in CONCACAF. For me, though, Mexicans are the hardest to predict, but I promise you now, if as a European, if we don't draw Mexico in our group, it's the host nation that most neutrals, at least over this side of the water, I believe, will be cheering for. I just believe that. I think the Mexican fan base as hosts are going to be quite contagious, and I think a lot of neutrals will want to see them do well. Having said that, I think this will probably be the most difficult home nation to draw because of that fan base, because of the atmosphere. They're going to be one I want England to avoid, really. So ideally, I would like England to avoid Mexico because I think they could cause some serious upsets. And finally, the US. Now, the US are probably the biggest enigma because arguably on paper, and the US fans certainly believe this at the minute, they believe they have by far the strongest squad out of Canada and Mexico. And I think to a point, they're right. The US currently have a very strong crop of players, or a strong crop of players, maybe not very strong yet. They've got a lot of players playing in Europe, but not necessarily regularly or making a true significant impact at the highest level in European leagues. But they are difficult to predict how they're going to turn up because they have been on some poor results, it has to be said. They've just lost again to Panama and Canada at home. And I think the most worrying thing about those fixtures in the Nations League that were being hosted by the US was the attendance. I mean, this attendance, there's no excuses for it. I don't care if it's a public holiday or whatever. These attendance figures for the US in a competitive game against some of their biggest rivals is just quite frankly embarrassing and completely unacceptable. Of course, European fans will be so familiar, particularly English fans, with Pochettino, who is currently their manager, for those of you that don't know. He was brought in really to make the most of this, what is perceived to be a very strong US team, and ultimately to get the most out of this talented crop of players. And at the minute, it's not been going to plan. But the US will certainly have the most familiar set of players to European fan bases, most certainly. Pulisic is probably the most high-profile player I think we would all know over here. They are currently ranked the highest though out of these 3 teams in the FIFA World Rankings, currently in 16th place. However, despite what I've said about the US, I do believe they are the strongest team out of these 3, on paper most certainly. I think the problem is going to come from the US is when the expectation gets lumped on, when all that pressure comes from the media because of that talented pool that they've got. I think expectations are going to be probably too high, and I think the pressure's going to get to them because this crop of players and this team have already shown that they have struggled with that pressure moving forward. But other talented players obviously include Weston McKenna at Juventus, Yunus Musa and Pulisic at AC Milan, Timothy Weah at Juventus, Tyler Adams at Bournemouth will be familiar to English fans. So there's no doubt the talent's there, and if it can click, the US could cause some upsets. I think they could make themselves a difficult opposition in those knockout rounds, and I fully expect them to get through the group. They could prove a very difficult team for anyone drawing them in the group stage. I'm a bit unsure about England because out of all these three nations, England have the best record historically against the US. Out of 12 games, we've only lost twice to them, and we haven't lost to them in over 30 years. In the last 6 games, the US haven't beaten England. So it does have to be said, though, out of competitive matches, England and the US have played each other 3 times, and the last 2 times have been draws. The US did cause one of the biggest shocks in English football history all those years ago. And I also think, as a US fan base, I think the US and the US national team I think they would really fancy England. They'd get really fired up for it. I think it means a lot to them, this fixture, if they drew England in particular. And I do think that'll cause a little bit of issues for us. So I would honestly like to avoid the US. I think the US could cause an upset against England in the group stages. But having said all this, I do believe out of all of these 3 home nations, I do think that the US have the biggest prospect of being also the biggest disappointment at this World Cup, because expectations are going to be much higher than what they are for Mexico and Canada, and they sometimes recently have disappointed significantly. So it's very difficult to sort of get to grips with how this US team is going to cope with a home tournament. Having said that, though, if the US get off to a really strong start, they could be a threat at this World Cup. Not to win it, but certainly to put some good nations to the sword. It does feel a bit like do or die time for this American crop of players. It'll be interesting to see how they cope with this tournament. So in conclusion, I think the US do have the strongest squad. I think Mexico have the biggest pedigree, and I think Canada can play with the biggest heart and biggest freedom. And I think that leads to quite an interesting dynamic between the 3 home nations. And ultimately, as an England fan, I wouldn't want to draw any of them. If I was forced to pick, if I had to pick, I would, of course, probably pick Canada, despite the fact that I don't think as a team they are the weakest. I think they're a very strong team. I just feel like that lack of experience sometimes at big tournaments will cost them, like it did in the last World Cup. They disappointed, really, considering the run of form they were on leading into Qatar. For me, Mexico would arguably be the most challenging team to face, because I think that home support and that dynamic and all that sort of atmosphere around Mexico at this World Cup will be so strong. And I wouldn't want my team to really get caught up in all that emotion. Similar to the US, really. Like I said, I think the US fans would absolutely love England in the group stages, and I think they'd be more up for it than us, if I'm honest with you. More up for it than what they would against another big nation. So I think England-US would be a fixture I'd like to avoid. But ultimately, this is a tournament. It's do or die for the US in particular. They have the talent to make an impact, at least at this tournament. But ultimately, for Mexico and the US, the pressure will be on. Thank you all so much for watching. If you got this far in the video, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you all on my next video.